wunderschönen guten Tag. Hi, my name is Matthias Rillig, and today I'll talk about rate of change in ecology. Now, I think most of us can relate to the rate of change because of everyday experience. Imagine, for example, it's a hot summer day and you want to go into the water, the lake water or the river water. Well, there's two ways you can do it. You can very slowly get gradually used to the cold water, and then eventually after a period of time you are immersed in the water. And the other way to do it is to, jump right in. And as you jump right in, of course, you will feel this immediate shock of immersion into the much, much colder lake water. And it'll come to you as a brief shock, whereas that shock was sort of much, much milder as you step by step sort of went into the water. And so this rate of change is also important in ecology because very many factors in ecology, and global change, for example, change very, very gradually. For example, CO2 concentration in the atmosphere goes up very gradually, or temperature goes up very gradually, or even eutrophication with, for example, nitrogen by atmospheric deposition that changes very gradually, or the arrival of microplastic from also atmospheric deposition will gradually increase. But the reality of how we study things in ecology is different, because we typically, if we want to study warming, we just switch on the higher temperature in a bunch of incubators, or if we want to study the effects of elevated CO2, well, we just switch on the elevated CO2 in some chambers. If we want to study the effects of microplastic, we just mix microplastic in the soil. And so these experiments are sort of sudden on, or rather abrupt experiments, when in reality, the factor that they want to study happens to very often be one that only very gradually increases. And so now we've recently looked at this in the literature. This is a study, a review paper on systematic mapping that's been led by Liliana Pinek and India Manzoor, with contributions from Milica Lakovic and Masahiro Rio, which is French, USA, Serbian, Japanese, German collaboration, sort of typical of our lab. And what have they found? So first of all, most of these studies have been done at the level of the individual, say the individual fish or the individual plant, and comparatively much, much less work has been done at the higher levels of the ecological hierarchy, in particular at the level of the community or at the ecosystem level, studying ecosystem process rates. So that's one clear pattern. We know relatively little about these responses to different rates of change when you move up the level of the ecological hierarchy. To some extent, that is sort of understandable, because often these studies are much more logistically involved than studying individual organisms. So it's, in a way, understandable. The second point that came out of this analysis is that there was a very clear preference for studying certain factors in this respect with rate of change, and in particular the factor that was studied most was temperature. Of course, temperature is an important state variable. It's connected to global warming, so to global change and climate change. So again, this makes sense that it would be one of the more studied variables, but it was at the expense of also studying other variables this way, which, as I mentioned before, very many variables really in reality are gradually increasing parameters, and they are not being studied this way. So this is a reason for concern. So what are some recommendations coming out of this study? Is the first one is really gradual and abrupt are just often very ill-defined. People mean different things by the same words, and there are various different study systems. So rather than calling something gradual versus abrupt, we just think of rates of change as a continuum and not single out some categories that we would then call for particular system, gradual and abrupt, because it may differ from a different perspective. So the first recommendation is basically deal with rate of change as a continuum that it in reality also really is when you study the effects of the duration and temporal shape of some treatment. The second recommendation is really more fully report the parameters of the experimental design. So sometimes it was not clear how long, for example, that ramping was, and it was also sometimes not clear how long then the system, once it had sort of ramped up, stayed at that plateau level. But that's all important to know, because that allows us to really compare the different studies that have been done on different organisms and different systems. So it's important that reporting on parameters really improves. At the individual level, there is a lot of work on phenotypic plasticity, like how organisms physiologically adjust to any given treatment, say exposure to salinity or microplastic or warming. And one of the conclusions of this paper is that the temporal dimension of this application of a treatment should really be included in the study of phenotypic plasticity as another axis. And finally, as this study had really identified a big gap in terms of studying rates of change in ecology when you move up the levels of the ecological hierarchy, the last recommendation would be to focus really on these levels, and also to include studies that transcend these levels from the individual to the population, to the community, and then to the ecosystem process level. Yeah, so overall, I think it's very important that we as ecologists, especially in global change biology, pay closer attention to the rate of change, because it also may change the outcome of an experiment when you give organisms time to adjust to the new condition, for example. And basically, in the end, it is important to include more and more aspects of the reality of the change in the way we design experiments. So, for example, by mimicking this gradual change in an experiment by means of gradually increasing a factor like temperature or elevated CO2, we get that one step closer to reality, and that's worth it. Hi there! If you like this video, don't forget to click like down there, and also remember to subscribe to the channel, and feel free to leave comments. See ya!